We'll start now. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of Australia's and the world's most fascinating and important contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. Today, we're joined by political activist, commentator, and social media influencer Hisham Al-Omeisy to speak about Yemen, the soft underbelly of the Arabian Peninsula, where a civil war has been raging since 2014. Hisham, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me, John.
Hisham, when we were a radio show on Radio Adelaide, we did look at Yemen through the eyes of an aid worker, Riona Judge McCormack. What we discovered was that Yemen is the world's biggest humanitarian disaster, not helped by the fact that foreign interference has prevented any form of good governance. As a Yemeni, how do you see Yemen's plight?
It's devastating, but it's also a little bit humiliating when people only see Yemen as an impoverished country that constantly needs aid. I mean, as a Yemeni, when people approach me and the first thing they say is, we heard that Yemen is the biggest humanitarian crisis, that almost 82% of the population needs aid. And coming from a country that has been historically known to be a very generous country and welcoming of foreigners, and we usually treat everybody very decently when they come and shower them with gifts. And now we're standing in a position when everybody just looks down at us and just sees us through that prism. It's humiliating, honestly.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think can actually change this around? I mean, it seems like, you know, this mark against Yemen is here to stay for at least the immediate term, yeah?
It is. And this is one of the main things we talked about since the beginning of the conflict, when the UN came along and they started pumping aid into Yemen. And we said, this is pretty much futile, because what you need is structured rebuilding of Yemen. What you need is opening of the ports, for instance. What you need is sustainable development projects on the ground. But if you keep putting us on these posters as being hungry, as being needy, and keep carrying out these donor conferences every year, the situation is just going to get worse. And this is basically what happened. At the beginning of the conflict, we needed about 1 billion a year, and now we need about 4 billion a year in terms of humanitarian aid. And even then, for instance, this year, we needed about $4 billion in aid, and it's only have been half funded so far, and we're nearing the end of the year. And this has been the norm for the past 7 years. So no amount of aid is gonna cover the needs in Yemen. What we need is a structured assistance, help rebuilding the current infrastructure, opening the ports. We have huge capital flight out of Yemen because of the insecurity, so address the security sector so that at least Yemeni money would stay inside Yemen, let alone the foreign aid, basically, not just aid, but investments coming back into the country. The other thing is that we export oil and gas, and we have a huge facility down south, the YLNG, the Yemen liquefied natural gas. So that was one of our main exports. So let's restart that facility so that we can make our own money, basically, and cover our economy. But nobody's looking into that. They're just looking to providing us with sacks of wheat and a quota every year, instead of helping us get up back on our feet.
I'm curious, just on that alone, do you think that aid agencies, including the UN, do they actually take the locals serious enough to actually listen to them? Because it seems from what you've just said, you know, it's great to have the bag of wheat, but really you've got strategic level problems here. Who's actually listening to the Yemenis themselves?
To be honest with you, not much. Not a lot of people listen to the Yemeni local voices. I mean, we've been screaming at the top of our voices for the past 7 years, but there hasn't been any change in that strategic approach. I mean, we talked to the UN, we talked to UNICEF, we talked to the UNDP, we talked to the FAO, we talked to the World Bank, we talked to the IMF, and every time it seems that they have their own planning. And we got to a point where we started to suspect and honestly think they want the Yemeni crisis to continue, because as long as the crisis continues, they're in business.
Yep.
And this is one of the things when I remember a few years ago, we had this huge fight in one of the meetings that one of these organizations that shall remain nameless. We were in the offices and we got in there and we were like, you're driving $250,000 cars, armored cars. And there are about 200 of those cars in your parking lot. And you're getting salaries upwards of $10,000 a month, while Yemenis are starving to death, and you're having all this huge army of aid workers. But if you repurpose this, if you redesign this, much of that money would go to the local instead of your fancy cars, your fancy buildings, your fancy travel allowances. And it looks like you're benefiting from these crises more than anybody else. And just the price of one of those cars, I could have built 10 wells in some of the most remote areas in Yemen. I have provided cows in some of the villages, bought cows in some of the villages. But you're coming with this convoy that is worth $3 million, all these aid workers, all these cars, all these things, and to just drop one single well in a remote area. And you then charge basically what they call a danger pay, and you charge your salaries, and you charge for your security for just a well that costs about $300. It's really, it's insane.
Well, all I can say about that, Hisham, alhamdulillah, you said it. It's on record now. It will go out to Australia. But look, let me tell you, your story is very reminiscent of my observations of being in Ethiopia. You've got the UN ensconced in Addis Ababa. You've got these fleets of up-armored, Toyota Land Cruisers, not a speck of dirt on these things. You've got the commissars from the UN coming into the nightclubs, leading a wonderful existence. And let me tell you, there's nothing wrong with an Ethiopian nightclub. But when you see all these officials, coming on at the end of once they punch out, you kind of think to yourself, well, what is your primary mission? It's not to be at the nightclub. It's there to help the local people, right? So just across from Yemen is Ethiopia, and no doubt we can rope in all of the Horn of Africa, and it's all suffering from the same slings and arrows of fate, yeah? Insane.
It is, exactly, it's insane, and this is one of the reasons the Yemenis have grown upset, not just upset, honestly. They started to hate on these kind of organizations coming to Yemen because they're trying to make a buck out of it.
Yeah.
Without that they don't have that much of an impact locally. And we've seen an exponential growth in the number of these kind of organizations coming to Yemen. And where the alternative is you could have worked with some local organizations, you could have given that aid directly, or better yet, create sustainable development projects. And now, for instance, and I visited Geneva and I visited some countries in Europe where there are conferences about Yemen, and I walk into the room and there's this big poster of a malnourished Yemeni child. And they asked me to be a speaker, and I go and speak. And whenever I talk about the political issues, the military issues, all these humanitarian issues we have, they don't want to listen. They marginalize you and they say, like, just focus on saying that 80% of the population is in need. Just focus on saying that 14 million Yemenis are basically are food insecure. They just want you to repeat some key lines and talking points and leave the building because it serves purposes.
Yeah.
That's really insane because the Yemeni problem is not just the humanitarian crisis is a result of an actual conflict. Let's address the root of the conflict, which has resulted in this humanitarian crisis. But everybody's just focusing on the humanitarian crisis itself. And even then, it's not about fixing it. It's about just basically applying band-aids, annual band-aids to it.
Okay, so Hisham, what would you say to those who would then counter what you've just said by saying, well, it's better having a sack of wheat than having nothing? So obviously the aid agencies are doing something good, right?
Well, that's the hurtful part, because that's basically it's what we call in Yemen ibtizaz, which is basically you're blackmailing us. You realize our need, And you do realize that we can't say to that sack of wheat, so you're putting us in that corner and saying it's better than nothing. Would you want us to cut off that aid? If you go with the narrative, we'll just cut off that aid.
Yep.
And I'm telling you honestly, in some areas of Yemen, they would tell you point blank, it's like, you know what? And excuse my French, they'll be screw you and screw your sack of wheat. Our dignity as well. And we're not gonna allow you to mistreat us just that way, in that manner, for that sack of wheat. But if we go the other side of the coin.
Yeah, look, I hear what you're saying. But if we go now into the sort of strategic level issues that we have, on the ground in Yemen, which is just complicating things beyond belief. So when the Saudis and Emiratis went into Yemen, their war plans seem to have diverged quite dramatically. Has this been patched up, or are Riyadh and Abu Dhabi still holding fast to their own respective agendas?
Let's revisit this and repackage this. The thing is, it's not just Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. There's a whole host of coalition behind that, the Saudi-led coalition. And although we've been hearing of a fallout for the longest time between various members of the Saudi-led coalition, the plan of action hasn't changed. The narrative hasn't changed. Some people find some level of comfort in saying, oh, they're falling apart, which means it might bring about the end of the war. This has been since the beginning. In reality, that hasn't changed the war in Yemen. It hasn't changed the tempo of the war in Yemen. Airstrikes are still ongoing, the military support is still ongoing. Saudi Arabia and UAE still host factions of the various factions on the ground in their own countries. There are so many Yemenis in UAE and Saudi Arabia as well, and they're still taking the lead. That hasn't changed. But here's the thing that we start to suspect in Yemen: these kind of points or these kind of news cyclically are circulated in the headlines to basically distract from the fact that the war is still ongoing and it will go on for years to come. This is the 7th year of the war. This is a war where after a few months into it, everybody said the Saudi-led coalition achieved its objective and the war is over. Here is a new operation, which is dubbed Bringing Hope. Well, they've been bringing hopes for the past 6 years.
Yes, they have.
But nothing has changed. The war is still ongoing and it's raging. It didn't even de-escalate. It's actually escalated in some areas. In areas like Marib, for instance, in the past few months, the fighting has actually escalated there, and it escalated in places like Al-Bayda, which is basically the Midlands of Yemen. And currently, we have about 46 battlefronts inside Yemen. 46! Not one, not two, 46 battlefronts inside Yemen. So when people tell you like it's disintegrating, the coalition is disintegrating, there's disagreements, there's a level of de-escalation, it isn't as bad as the beginning of the war. It is. It's still the same, if not more. It's just that it dropped from the headlines. People now are no longer interested in the conflict in Yemen. And because it's the nature of it, because it's so complex, their attention span is so short, and they have other issues to worry about, like Afghanistan is eclipsing us right now.
Of course.
So they don't understand all these little details and the fact that the war is still raging across the country.
I happened to have come across a documentary on Yemen possibly about a year ago, and I think it might have been the BBC or CNN, one of the big, mainstream media providers. And it was a very daunting kind of documentary. The way that they put these things on, it's all very depressing, And anyway, so you had the somber music and you had these people going and interviewing Yemenis. It didn't matter what side of the conflict zone they happened to be on. And one interesting thing did come up from all their interviewing, and that is that there are, like aid convoys and aid that is being delivered, but is being held up at the ports because local Yemenis, now whether or not they happen to be belonging to a faction or whether they're just criminal gangs, are basically intimidating aid workers in their efforts to distribute aid. How much of that really is a problem? It's
actually, I'm glad you actually mentioned that, because we should have mentioned that earlier. is that a lot of the Yemeni factions are actually taking part of that aid, charging taxes to it, reselling it on the black market, one. Two, they're diverting a lot of their aid to their own people who have sworn allegiances to them. The Houthis are taking part of that aid. The Yemeni government, there's a faction that also under the umbrella of the Yemeni government or the Saudi coalition, they're also diverting aid. But it's mostly it's the Houthis. And you go into places like Sana'a, and it's kind of sad because you find this, for instance, sack of wheat that has UN all over it, and it's being sold, and it's aid, it's packaged as aid, but it's being sold on the black market. But that's how they make money. These militias, these factions, they need money. They need food for their fighters. And there's nothing much get into the country, so they end up taking the aid that is coming to the country, they funnel it. And a lot of the aid organizations are caught up in this dilemma where they say, we need this aid to deliver it from point A to point B, but there's a chokehold right in the middle that is controlled by one of the factions. So we have to basically grease the wheels. So we give them 5% of that aid, or we pay them money, or any other way. But still, that doesn't distract from the fact that that aid from the onset needs to be restructured.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. Okay, so we mentioned the Houthis. So for our audience, can you explain to our audience the relationship between Yemen's Houthi rebels and Iran? Has this been overplayed, or is Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps playing a significant role in stoking the conflict?
Well, the Houthis and Iran are very closely linked. I mean, you could sit there and deny it all you want, but the fact is they're very closely allied. It is true that the Houthis have their own mindset. Here's the thing, the media try to pitch Houthis as proxies for Iran. To an extent, yes, but you have to always remember that the Houthis have their own mindset. They're very strong-headed. They have their own plans. They have their own agendas. But of course, they're assisted by Iran. And we've seen the Houthis, for instance, in the past few months, going to Iran and meeting with the leaderships of the Iranian guards, the Iranian political leadership, and coming back. And the Iranian ambassador is actually in Sana'a. And he's all over the place, meeting with all these officials, giving them guidance and what have you. So there is that relationship. But Iran's support, for instance, militarily, for the Houthis pales in comparison with the Saudi military support for the Yemeni government. Yep. You don't have Iranian fighter jets bombing inside Yemen. You don't have Iranian tanks inside Yemen. But what you have is technology transfer. For instance, the Houthis' ballistic capabilities, the Houthis' drone capabilities, they didn't come out of thin air. Of course, they received assistance. And of course, all points figure to Iran. That's where they receive the training. That's where they receive the technology transfer. But again, as I mentioned, nobody's hands are clean in Yemen, all these factions. Everybody's assisted by one country or another. Yeah. So in Yemen, the joke is when somebody says, you're Iranian, you're backed by Iran. You turn back and say, as if you're not backed by anybody. You're probably backed by Saudi or UAE or Oman or any other country. Everybody's backed by somebody. So that's not one form of criticism when you criticize that are backed by one country or another.
So with regard to the damage that the civil war has caused your country, can you remind our listeners how many people have been killed in Yemen since 2014 and how many people have been internally displaced?
Well, let's start with the internally displaced because that's an easier number, because there have been surveys to pinpoint that number, which is about 4.1 million. But it's a huge number. For a country with a population of about 30 million, that's huge. But the problem with basically gauging the number of the dead is difficult because you don't have monitors on the battlefronts. And that's where most of the people are getting killed. You don't have people in remote areas. Yemen was a weak state to begin with. So our census, our government institutions were weak. So Even before the war, we couldn't get the numbers right. So you can imagine now with the government falling apart, there's no government, honestly, at this point. But with that falling apart, it's kind of difficult. But the estimates run at about 150 to 100 as a very conservative estimate, puts it at about 150 to 200,000 people who are dead. And this is as a direct result of the war. But there's also a lot of people who are dying and an indirect or a collateral damage because of the war. There's people who are dying because of disease. There are people who are dying because of hunger. There are people dying because of starvation, because places like in Hodeidah, children, for instance, I remember one of these figures from the UNICEF, it's that a child dies in Yemen every 10 minutes. That's huge.
Yes, it is. Very distressing, actually.
Exactly. And I remember going to the hospitals in Sana'a, and it's very devastating because you walk into the hospital, and I remember this very vividly, and you see mothers on the corridors with their children in their hands, and they're dying because they couldn't get the most basic medicine that could have prevented the death of their child. And then you see all these politicians living it large outside and abroad and talking about the conflict and politicizing it, while the common folks are literally starving to death or dying because of the lack of the simplest things. And these people, for instance, and I remember these also from the airstrikes, and this one was really close to my house, and there was an airstrike that killed almost about 90 people, and we went to the streets after that, and there were children on the street, parts of children on the street. And I remember mothers wailing and fathers getting to the scene, and they're picking up bits and pieces of their children. And it's very numbing, but it's also the aftermath of it. Can you imagine people who looked at that and said, right now, it's only revenge on my mind. I will not let this pass. And their families start joining the fighting fronts. Their friends, their families join the fighting fronts. People who saw that footage, who witnessed that, joined the fighting fronts.
Sure.
So things like this in the war do not end the war. They actually deepen the grievances and create more fighters, if not more monsters. Because these people become desensitized and they go and in turn commit atrocities. And this has been happening for the past 7 years. And right now, I talk to Yemenis, especially close to the battlefronts, and they don't listen to reason anymore. They have been desensitized. They're there to get revenge, and they won't stop. It will be extremely difficult for them to stop. And I remember, I was in a conference in Bonn about a year ago, and everybody was like, let's create incentives, let's talk to them about incorporating them in the government. And I was like, what you need is this huge rehab program, psychological support, and bringing these people back from the edge first. Because these people, it's going to be extremely for them, it's really hard for you to reason with them in the first place.
What about maybe a truth and reconciliation process similar to what happened in South Africa? I mean, I suppose that's probably the only thing that would allow a country that's so deeply divided and deeply distrustful of themselves, you know, if you go group by group, it's the only thing that would probably work in the end of the day, wouldn't you think?
John, I have 2 master's degrees. I have a master's degree in peace, conflict, and security from University of Catalonia, and another degree in reconciliation and peace building from the UK. We tried to apply all that I learned, all that I gained. And we thought, you know what, here's off-the-shelf solutions like these committees that you mentioned that we can use in Yemen. Let's try to apply that. The thing is, Yemen is very unique, the social fabric has been torn to bits that we couldn't get to basically pinpoint a starting point to get these communities in place. Like a surgeon, for instance, a surgeon needs a bit of flesh for his starting point to start sewing pieces back together. Those pieces are non-existent at this point in Yemen. If you're going to start with these peace committees or these truth and reconciliation committees, you need some sort of receptivity. You need to know where to start. But when everybody is still engaged in the fighting, they still want more blood. You cannot start that kind of process.
Yep. Okay, well, I mean, on to another equally depressing topic, refugees. Here in Australia, we don't hear anything about Yemeni refugees. We hear about the war, we hear about the internally displaced, but there must be refugees. And, you know, where are they going? Do they go into Saudi? Do they go into the Emirates, Oman? Where do they go?
Okay, I'm currently in Cairo, John. And I go back and forth for these conferences, for these meetings. And I'll be honest with you, there were times that I was thinking, I want to seek asylum, because when I was back home, I was taken in prison for 6 months and tortured. And it was thanks to an international campaign pushing for my release. The Houthis eventually released me. So I had a case, unlike other refugees. But here's the kick. When I expressed, just slightly expressed, that maybe I would want to seek asylum, everybody shunned me. Everybody was like, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. Because Yemenis are not welcome. We're not welcome anywhere. And because of a couple of times when I expressed that maybe I would want to explore that option, because I'm a father of kids and I want to see them in a safe place. Maybe selfish, but if I have that opportunity, I want to get my kids to safety. But these diplomats who shall remain nameless were like, no, you cannot do that. And next time around, when I applied for a visa, they crossed my name on a list. And like, maybe he's at risk of flight. And I'm like, you told me not to, and I wouldn't. I won't. But imagine, and I'm fortunate enough to have connections. I'm fortunate enough that I can travel back and forth. But there are millions who can't. We have Yemeni refugees and asylum seekers stuck in Ethiopia. We have Yemeni refugees and asylum seekers stuck in Turkey, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Djibouti. We are all over the place, but nobody is willing to take us, for instance, to Australia, to Europe, US or Canada. No, we're not welcome. And I remember that there was a point when Canada announced taking in about 20,000 Syrian refugees. And this was, I think it was a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. And we were devastated in Yemen because we wanted a way out. We wanted a path. And we are qualified. It's not that we're not qualified. We're educated. And we would add to those communities that we would relocate, we resettle in. But Canada never looked at us. They would never even give us visas, let alone seek an asylum case or a pathway to asylum. And it's been the same case with other countries. And here, for instance, just last week, and I was meeting with some Yemenis here, and they're like, even if we have just to go to conferences, we're not doing anything. We just want to go for a conference. We rejected visas because all these European countries fear that we might get into the country and basically apply for asylum. So even though we have a legitimate reason to go in for a business visit, to attend a conference or what have you, we're rejected visas. That's how unwanted the Yemenis are across the world.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with Yemeni political commentator and activist Hisham Al-Omeisy on Yemen. You know, I'm going to go way off script here, but just picking up what you've said, do you believe that the unwelcoming nature of many Western countries has a lot to do with the war on terrorism and the idea that Yemen is like some sort of black hole where all terrorists get their training. You know, yes, there was Afghanistan, yes, there is Syria, but in some weird way, it always seems that Yemen, especially if I look at it from an Australian perspective, you know, we have what was it, the Abu Sayyaf movement and various other terrorist organizations up in Southeast Asia, based in Indonesia. You know, you've got a few there. And of course, the leading lights could be a person of Yemeni descent, you know, that managed over many years. Their family fled Yemen and went off to Indonesia and settled there. So this whole notion of the West, the war on terrorism, Yemen, Islamism, and all those terrible things that we see, and the violence that comes as a consequence of the civil war that we're currently witnessing in Yemen, it seems to be shoring up almost like I hate to say it, but almost like a racist pushback. Would you agree?
It is. I would agree. And this is one of the things that we suffered greatly from since the beginning of 2001 and forward, when every news agency on the planet would say Osama bin Laden, who came from his ancestral homeland, Yemen.
Right. Yeah.
Osama bin Laden was Saudi. Just say he's Saudi.
Yeah.
But they kept tagging that. They said, like, his ancestral homeland, Yemen. Why would you do that? And from there forwards, of course, we had one of the most dangerous AQAP branches became the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is basically based in Yemen. But that came later on, after the Taliban, after AQAP in Afghanistan, after the AQ in Afghanistan. And because of that, but we gained this notoriety. It's like Yemen is a hub, a meeting point for all these terrorist groups. But when you come and you're trying to dissect that, and you see that the number of Al-Qaeda in Yemen is in the hundreds. And I remember talking to one of the analysts in the US, where we're talking about Al-Qaeda, and we had to write a piece, a comparative analysis piece between these various groups, Al-Qaeda, Sharia al-Islamiyya, Al-Houthis. And she was quite shocked when she realized it was only hundreds. And she's like, Yemen is very notorious of being Al-Qaeda hub, but it's only hundreds. And I'm like, yes, it's only hundreds. We became very notorious because when news report about Yemen, they say Yemen houses the most active Al-Qaeda branch, but they don't go into the details of how many members of Al-Qaeda are in Yemen. Or if they have that kind of access or mobility from Yemen to other countries. Yemen is surrounded. Yemen is surrounded by Saudi Arabia, by Gulf states, by these international waters, all these navies in the international water. So to travel back and forth for Al-Qaeda members is actually hard. It's not impossible. It's been done in the past, but it's hard. It's not that easy. But when you paint that picture that it's a viper's nest, and where Al-Qaeda just moves around the globe and attacks the whole world from it creates that stigma, so that everybody starts associating Yemen with terrorists. So, but again, as I mentioned earlier, Yemen also has a very vibrant diaspora abroad, and inside Yemen also the vibrant community, well-educated, Western educated, relatively doing well. They don't see that. These, for instance, Western states, they just think they associate Yemen, poverty, very problematic. So you know what? It's much easier for me to do, instead of me doing the research or due diligence and vetting these people before coming to my country, I would rather just shut the door.
Yeah.
Who's going to complain? It's just Yemenis. We don't have that much of a business bilateral relationship, so our diplomatic relations would not be hurt, even if I shut the door. So it's an easy way out.
Hisham, what can you tell us about the Yemeni government? I mean, you did say that it was pretty much torn to pieces and there's not much left of it. But whatever's left of it, is it a plaything for foreign interests? And if so, which of the foreign interests are benefiting from supporting whatever passes for the Yemeni government?
Let's get one thing straight. The Yemeni government is a house of cards, a very shaky one at that as well. And it's a formation of these multiple political factions that are there to basically protect their own personal interests. They're not there to serve Yemenis or Yemen. The majority of the government is abroad. They're not operating from inside Yemen. And they're living a very high-class life. They're traveling around in fancy jets, and while Yemenis are starving. And it's kind of funny because one of these ministers was doing a tour last week across Europe with his fancy suit, fancy cars, and big belly, and talking to these Europeans and saying, my country is starving. And I'm like, you're the last person to talk about that. You're the last person to talk about that. You're there trying to raise some funds that will never end in the bellies of those hungry people in Yemen. It will end up in the hands of corrupt officials. And this is one of the reasons why the government is so incompetent and it's divided. I don't want to attack the whole government because there are some decent people, but the majority aren't. And they're not there to basically save Yemen or restore the state. They are there knowing very well it's temporary, so they're trying to make the biggest buck out of it while there. And within a period of time, they'll be moving to other countries, not even returning to Yemen, because they know they lack popular support inside the country. So they know already and are planning ahead for a lavish life in exile.
Yeah, politicians, they're all the same color, no matter wherever you go. I mean, they always look after themselves first and foremost, and the people. They talk about looking after the people, but they really don't look after the people. And I mean, in this situation, it's just outstandingly ridiculous. So, Hisham, what are your most immediate concerns for Yemen apart from the ongoing civil war? I mean, we know that there's a chronic shortage of water. How has Yemen been faring during the COVID-19 outbreaks? Obviously, your health services would have been already up to the wazoo in terms of trying to take care of the wounded from the various battlefronts that you were mentioning earlier. And of course, we've got the other aspect, the chat addiction apparently is a big thing. How does this all sort of play into the overarching very depressing framework you put forward?
Okay. I'm gonna share something personal. My mother's-in-law mom died yesterday in Aden.
Sorry.
Thank you. But here's the thing. There's no electricity, there's no water. She's old. But because of the lack of electricity and a lot of water, it got really complicated. She had difficulty breathing. She started puking and she choked on it, and the situation really deteriorated rapidly and she passed away. There's COVID inside Aden, there's COVID inside Sana'a. We don't have the health facilities. Most of the health facilities were destroyed by the war. They were inadequate to begin with before the war, but whatever we had remaining was devastated. And I'm sure you must have heard about the multiple airstrikes that targeted hospitals, the shelling, because of the interfight the country as well. It's not just airstrikes, the shelling, cross-shelling. And it's a very devastating situation that even the ill cannot be, for instance, rushed to hospitals and saved. So people, like the mother of the mother-in-law, she dies in her bed because she couldn't get the most basic things, medical attention. And this has been a recurrent theme across the board in Yemen. For instance, and I remember this when we started talking about the ventilators, and I had a couple of organizations contact me thinking since at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and they said that we raised this much amount of money, can we send stuff to Yemen? And I'm like, they need ventilators, and they're like, okay, we'll put more money into it, and we'll send you ventilators. And I contacted the hospitals, and they said, like, we don't even have electricity. How are we going to operate the ventilators? And I'm like, but we bought generators for you 2 years ago for that specific hospitals. And they came back and said, but we don't have gas. We don't have gas money. Gas the price has exponentially increased in the past few years. And now we cannot afford the gas. So we have the equipment, we cannot afford the gas. And we need the gas to run the generators, to run the ventilators. So instead of that, forget the COVID patients. Literally, they said, forget the COVID patients. If you have the money, send us these pills. And they gave me a list of pills and medication that they needed. People who are diabetic, people for malaria, for what have you, and all of these other diseases. They're like, you know what, we have to prioritize, and with whatever, we have to work with whatever we are given. So don't go fancy with the ventilators, send us pills, send us medications, and may God be with the COVID patients.
Okay.
It's about priority. It's a conflict zone, so you just have to prioritize. Yeah. You have to deal with the hand that has been given to you.
All right. I wish there was a happier note for all this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to manufacture one for us. But let me just get through this one question. Do you think that the United States' recent defeat in Afghanistan will re-energize Islamist militant groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a group that is a player in the Yemeni battle space? Do you think this is going to have an effect on the world?
Honestly, I don't have much information to have an informed opinion about that. So we're so messed up in Yemen with our little all these small fires across this forest that is Yemen, that even when they started talking about Afghanistan, we were like, we have our own problems to deal with. The only thing we came out with after what happened in Afghanistan, we're like, now Yemen, which has already been dubbed the Forgotten War, is going to be even further eclipsed by what is happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Hisham, I had reason to interview an Ethiopian scholar probably about 3 weeks ago now. And we did a podcast on a sister podcast program that we've got, Strategic on. And we were talking about nationalism and the idea that, you know, for many years, nationalism, at least in a Western sense, has been given a very bad rap. You know, it's brought us Hitler, it's brought us militarist Japan, it's brought us fascist Italy, it's done all kinds of terrible things. And yet, I think that in terms of civil programs and, you know, the idea of bringing a country that is less developed together, the idea of nationalism holds some merit. How do you see a Yemeni national identity coming out of all of this tragedy? Is that at all possible, do you think?
Let me tell you from a practical experience with what we've had in the past 6 years. We tried to basically repair that rift between all these Yemeni factions and creating around that national identity. What we ended up having is all these minuscule nationalist movements. For instance, in south of Yemen, they started saying, we are actually separate from the north. We're not even Yemeni, we're Southern Arabians. And we demand secession. We don't have our own entities. Let's go back to the period between 1990, which was the unification of Yemen. And similarly, other factions started coming forth in places like Al-Mahra and Socotra, which is to the east of the country, because of that nationalistic spirit. And they're saying, okay, we need our own region, which is a precursor to our own, basically, little country. So we've had a really bad experience with that. And the Houthis, for instance, had played on that nationalistic identity as well, saying, we are Arabs, we are Muslim, we are descendants of Qahtan, we are descendants of the Prophet, but also that backfired because that fervor created people who are extremists, who won't listen to reason. And it created this dichotomy of you are either with us or against us. And you're only with us if you have to check these boxes. If you're from this specific family who has this descendancy, basically lineage inside Yemen, or you're from the specific region. So it's almost became a fascist movement. So then it's because of that, we started delineating people. People from Sana'a are different from people in Damar. People from Aden are very different from people in Sana'a because that's in the north and it is in the south. And I'm not sure if you heard this, but there was a Yemeni from the north who was killed near Lahj, near Aden. Lahj is the gateway of Aden, basically, a government that is gateway of Aden, because people thought he was affiliated with the Houthis, but because also in that kind of checkpoint, Northerners always face racism there. Because now, because of the war, because of the conflict, because of these nationalistic identities, they see the Northerners as enemies. I'm Yemeni, I'm from the north, I'm anti-Houthi. But if I go to Aden, I'm right away perceived as being a Houthi Northerner. Even if I tell them that the Houthi actually took me, tortured me, imprisoned me, forcibly disappeared me, I'm a victim here. I don't agree with them. They would still say, but you're still a Northerner.
You can't win.
So, yeah, you can't win.
Yeah. Okay, Hisham, finally, it seems that Yemen has been cast adrift by the international community, the unloved and unwanted stepchild of the Gulf. What hope do you see for the country's unification and for peace in the future?
It's going to take a while. It's going to take some time, but it also needs, the current approach is very overly simplistic. It's very superficial. What you need is to basically understand the roots of the conflict and basically, and also as well, and address them. And I remember right now people thinking like, okay, 7 years, we're trying to understand the conflict, but we didn't manage to. I'm like, no, you didn't really put your heart into understanding it. Don't give us that lip service. You never actually tried to really understand it. Carry out surveys. Ask the people what they want. You never did that. You always talking to these elite set of people, these government officials, and then you're designing your solutions based on their input. But you never actually talk to the people on the ground. These various districts. There are 333 districts across Yemen. Have you talked to the 333 people, 333 districts? No, you didn't. Have you understood the kind of issues that they have? Some of these districts, the issue is as simple as having electricity or a water. And that's one of the main drivers of the conflict in their own perspective. So these are solvable problems, but you didn't. You're looking at it from top to bottom instead of from bottom to top. The other thing, the peace process, the UN-led peace process. Again, you're talking to two factions only, Yemeni government and the Houthis. The war has fractured Yemen. The number of factions has splintered out of control. There are upwards of 28 factions, main factions, let alone the sub-factions, main factions inside Yemen, in each region, sometimes in each district. There are 22 governorates with their own unique demography and factions. But then you go to the UN and invite to the table the Yemeni government and the Houthis, and you expect that if and when you strike a deal between these two, that deal will hold in Yemen. It will never hold. You don't have the buy-in from the population on the ground, from all these various factions. You're trying to create a ceasefire between the Yemeni government and the Houthis, the Yemeni government that is not existing on the ground at the beginning, in the first place, and the Houthis. But what about the fighting in places like Hodeidah, which is a totally different faction? It's called the National Resistance Force. That doesn't fall on the Houthis or the Yemeni government. What about that? When they talk with using all these fancy words, we need a ceasefire to start the peace process. Where? My question right away is ceasefire where? There are 46 to 48 battlefronts inside Yemen. Where is the ceasefire? You'll tell me in Hodeidah, I'll tell you Hodeidah is a different faction. How can you convince the faction in Hodeidah of the ceasefire when you're only talking to two other people? They're not on the table. What about the Southerners? The Southerners, they actually, that's half the country. Are they on the table? No. So how do you expect a ceasefire to hold? The Southerners have their own demands. They want to secede. They want a whole different country for themselves. And you're talking about a ceasefire and a peace plan? Listen to them, what they want. They have a totally different agenda.
Okay, well, all I can say, Hisham, shukran jazilan for being with us today. And thank you for your time and your insights on the focus. Yemeni political commentator and activist Hisham Al-Omeisy. We hope that our audience will pay very careful attention to this. You know, it is an ongoing crisis. And I think you will all agree that Hisham put a very hard edge on everything that has come out of Yemen. But I think we need a bit of a wake-up call here because it's an area that's been long forgotten, especially here in Australia. Sometimes our tyranny of distance works against us in that sense. Yeah. So anyway, that's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, Hisham Al-Omeisy, and to our producers, Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find the focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni.
Shukran, John.
Okay, masalama.
Ma salama.
Oh, before you go,